Microphone works. Let me just see. David Cardinal, can you raise your hand if you can hear me? Thank you. All right. So let's call the meeting to order. Roll call. Oh, I need to announce that we have some technical issues because some of the cameras are not working. The town has told us that they're working, they're trying to fix it, but it's not yet fixed. So there is no video, but there is a recording of the audio. So let's start with the roll call. Judy Murphy. Here. Marianne Plunder, here. Nona Girillo.
Here.
Peter Waltz. Yuki.
Yep.
Jörg Zimmermann. Megan. Here. And Teresa Coleman. Here. All right. Starting with oral communications. Does anybody in the room have any oral communications? No. Does anybody on Zoom? No. Okay, then let's get to the first and only item on the agenda, and that is our public study session on wildlife corridor and fencing. As actually everybody who is present has been present at the previous Conservation Committee meetings. So I was prepared to do an explicit explanation why we're here and how we got here. But obviously everybody who is listening knows what we were doing and how we got here. So just
for the record, Mariana, I would like to request you do that so that there's a clear record of why we're holding this meeting and what we hope to accomplish, if I may. Thank you.
So Assembly Bill 1889, which is called the Room to Roam Bill, was written into law in 2024. And this Assembly Bill 1889, which is also known as the Room to Roam Act, requires cities and counties in California to consider and implement measures to protect wildlife and habitat connectivity in their general plan and land use planning. This includes minimizing the disruption of wildlife movement and promoting wildlife-friendly development practices like fencing and lighting. And the aim of the bill is to balance development with the need to protect wildlife and their movement. The Conservation Committee has developed and suggested changes to the town fencing ordinance, and our suggested changes were presented to the ASCC a couple of months ago. And the feedback we received from the ASCC that our suggestions were too complicated to enforce with a fence ordinance. And the consensus coming out of the ASCC committee and then discussing it in the Conservation Committee was that we have a public study session where we are soliciting input from the public to see if there are some ideas we haven't thought about yet, and to build upon that. To summarize again, in the fencing regulation suggestions, our basic idea was the introduction of wildlife-friendly fencing. And wildlife-friendly fencing would permit wildlife to be able to cross through properties and cross between open spaces. And our idea was to put this into the ordinance and then to be enforced. And that's when the AACC said this is just too complicated and not possible. In the meantime, we have done a little bit more subcommittee work, and we have come to the conclusion that for the 2-acre plus parcels, Portola Valley is with the existing fence regulation in pretty good shape, as there are setbacks and definitions, like 20 feet on 3 sides and 20 to 50 feet on the front side, and horse fence and the definition of horse fencing. So the committee felt that for the 2+ acre parcels, there is a pretty good fence regulation. The only thing we decided we still have to work on is it is permitted for residents in those 2+ acre districts to have wire mesh inside the horse fencing. And horse fencing is this simple railing. And when we drive through town, the current wire mesh is certainly something that is too small to let wildlife through. So this is something we need to work on. Another point or another thing we figured out in the subcommittee meeting following the ASCC meeting, that the parcels smaller than 1 acre probably will not fit any sort of wildlife fencing just because of its size. And therefore, we decided for the time being that we will leave the smaller than 1 acre parcels out of the equation. And that brings us to our today's focus. What can we do to improve the fencing regulations for the 1 acre districts and still preserve free wildlife movement? We have actually developed a map, and yes.
Can I add something to your introductory things? I have 2 things that I think should go in the introduction part of it. One is that it wasn't just this room to roam bill. It was the fact that the committee was hoping to be proactive, that we see that over the next years, there's going to be increased development in town, whether we like it or not, and that it's important for us to look carefully at the fencing ordinance and get the ordinance updated and in place so that things that must be done ministerially will have this in place so that it can help protect the wildfire corridors that we currently have. And that if we don't do this, with new developments that happen, whether they be large or small, we're at risk of having them close off a lot of these important corridors because the current fence ordinance isn't protective enough. So that, I would say, that's the other important part of why we're doing this. And then why we're doing this specific study session was, as we were talking about it at ASCC and otherwise as individuals, it's obvious that there's some really strong opinions about this in town, from, keep your hands off my precious fences to, of course, there shouldn't be any fences. And so we thought it was really important to try to get as much public input as we could, rather than just sitting in isolation, deciding what we thought was appropriate. And so we were hoping with this study session that we would have a full room of people with various opinions and perhaps interesting ideas and valuable ideas to give us. And it's a little disappointing that we don't have that, but the people who are both in the room and online, I'm sure will have valuable things to say to us. Thanks.
Thank you. I would actually add for the record who is online. It's MJ Lee, Christy Curley, Karen Vatra, and Dave Cardinal. Okay, with that, I would like to bring up the map. We have a video, at least for her. I think that's something that can't be seen online because of the one camera. So what we have developed, we have looked, to just explain to those who cannot see the map. We have put together what we call a Portola Valley Zones of Permeability to Wildlife map. And
can I just say another meeting when you were not online, we were able to see the presentations, but we're not able to see you. So I'm surprised we can't see.
okay, which
If you had been on time, Christie,
you
you would have
get up
heard
the map?
Mary Ann say that there's only one camera working, so you're not then going to be able to see us.
Oh, I know that, but we were able to see the presentations like the map.
yeah, we are looking at the screen and says Nona Chiarelli has started screen sharing, but it's black. It's black. So they can't see us. There's problems. So it's okay. The map, I will be able to communicate the map. So basically, the map shows Westridge, Central Portola Valley, Corte Madera, Ranch, Blue Oaks, and what's this? Woodside? Woodside Highland? Well, whatever. I don't know what that is. Wayside and Woodside Highlands. Thank you. And we have defined very high permeability, which is basically no fencing, and that's in green, you can't see, and that would be the Ranch and Blue Oaks, obviously, because they don't have any fencing. And then in yellow, we have the high, and that is Westridge, and some areas, hayfields, thank you. And that's where we will have to work on the wire mesh improvement. And then we have, in orange, we have the medium, which is basically Central Portola Valley. Although, and we haven't done that yet on the map because it's going to be a little bit more complicated, there are areas in Central Portola Valley, the hill areas, which are properties that are 2 or certainly larger than 1 acre. And because of the way the hill ordinance is written, they don't have any fences now, and they can't really have fences. So theoretically, maybe the Westridge, not the Westridge, the 2+ acre ordinance could come into play, but obviously it isn't yet because it's a different area. And then we have, and I would also say, it might be a surprise to some that Central Portola Valley has what we call a medium penetration. And the reason is that there are plenty of parcels that have no fences. There are plenty of that do have perimeter fences, but there are plenty that don't. And then in pink, we have the low or small parcels. That's the smaller than 1, and that's like in Corte Madera. So I hope I was able to somehow get the picture across for the audience on Zoom. And with that, are there any more introductory comments before we open it up to input? Julie, anything else you have? No, you don't have anything else? Okay, so with that, I would like to open up the microphones. Let's try to keep it to maybe 3 minutes, but if somebody has a brilliant idea, then I'm sure we will listen. Let's first start in the audience. Yeah, up. Oh, it doesn't matter. You can sit there too. You can sit there and turn it on. Yeah. So we have, for the record, we have Dana Breen taking the microphone.
You know, I don't have a lot to say, and also a lot of you have heard. What? Closer? That one of the things that happened to me with the mountain lion cubs was that I knew where they were because of the lack of fencing, that they were back on Tintern and Grove, and those are just property after property, and which follow the creek, so that I knew they had access to water, and I knew that they weren't up against the fencing. And then the other thing, I was really heartbroken to see, and I'm a big fan of Willow Commons that just went in, but there were 2 deer back in the back corner stuck, you know, not being able to go through where the creek was, to the other side. And that was really hard for me because I didn't remember ASCC tackling that. You said you did, Judy, but what they did was it's all solid fencing with just wire underneath. A deer's not going to go do that. And so we just cut off that entire migratory pattern. And now that I've learned more and more about mountain lions, I mean, I know everything about mountain lions now, that we've got to open up their ability to move. Otherwise, they're not going to make it. And they're not going to make it really because of genetics. They've got to be able to access other lions. So, I mean, that's all I have to say really for now. I mean, it's always heartbreaking for me when I see fencing go in. And I am really anti-perimeter fencing, and I'm very anti-cheater fence. Anybody who puts wire on top of their 4-foot fence, I would like you guys to do something about that. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Then let's open it up to Zoom. This is going to be a little, Judy, can you look if, Karen, oh, Dave, you have the microphone. Dave Cardinal.
Sure, thanks. I guess I'm all for less fencing. So I know it's a really hard task for all of you. I just want to throw my support for whatever it means behind less of everything. I also think we worry about wildlife corridors, which is good, but we worry about habitat loss, and every fence around any part of a property that the animals can't get through is essentially a loss of what used to be their habitat. So, all I can say is I'm with you for whatever you can get done, and thanks for doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Karen, Karen Barther, you're next.
Hi, folks. These are just my thoughts that are they're a little disjointed because I don't have any great answers on this one at all. First, I think we should define what wildlife is. I mean, I know there's been a lot of threads of people trying to get rid of their gophers and their voles, and we're talking about large animals in this case. And so I think that's kind of important. Are we targeting the mountain lions and the deer? Is there any other animals that we're targeting? So that's kind of a question in my head. The other thing I think is super important in the 1 acre range that we're talking about is this is not a one size fits all by any means. Many of us live in the hills and partially fenced, partially not fenced. Some people that live in complete flat areas are like completely fenced around the back. And I just don't think there's a one size fits all. And that makes your life even harder than it is. And then the third comment, these are all just sort of thoughts more than anything very well thought out, is we don't forget about security. There was a threat, there was a break-in last weekend or the weekend before, and it's something that could impact what you're thinking about. So they're not well-developed thoughts, but thank you for listening.
Thank you. Nona, would you like to comment on what wildlife is in our context? Oh, okay, so we'll hold that. Thank you. Okay, Christy, you're next. Christy Crawley, you're next.
Yes, I sent in something a while ago regarding animal fencing. And if you look at ranches, I think the bottom rungs of a fence do not have the prongs, so they can get through without getting injured. On the scenic corridor, which I live on, a 4-foot fence is allowed, and you're right, the deer still come in and eat my apples and my roses. But, that's what we agreed to when we moved here, is a 4-foot fence. So, and it does allow for movement. I think that considering what the lower 2 prongs of a fence are is really important, that it not injure animals. And I do believe that a seasonal creek and a running creek all year long may have different goals for necessity, because that is where they drink their water. So we can't just say the creek's empty so we can do a 6-foot fence. If you went in the winter, the creek is running fully. So it's really important that we get this well thought out and different tiers. I know that Woodside has different setbacks even for ADUs in different parts of their city for the different needs of their city. I mean, it's just an example. When you're tight, when the houses are tight in together versus bigger lots and what can be done. So this is the same thing, but I want you to really think about the seasonal and ongoing creeks. And I was surprised that the priority conservation area does not include the creek of Los Trancos Creek along Alpine Road, and I'd like that considered by this conservation committee, but I know you're talking about fences today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Do we have somebody else, or did we go through the whole? Is there anybody else on Zoom? Okay, Dana.
Well, can I also say that we have hawthorns coming, and what do we want that fence to look like? Because they might fence an area, and that's 79 acres. And we know that I've seen a mountain lion go from Robert's parking lot back when there wasn't anything at Willows Commons and run from the creek behind Willows Commons, coming out and up to Hawthorns. So that is a movement area over into Arastadero.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Christy. So Dana Breen has more comments.
I appreciate that you guys are just doing fencing, but you know, as Nona, you're talking about the animals that we're trying to fence. I mean, I just had an incident with a snake yesterday that I'd seen for 2 days and it was hit. But it also, I see snakes get caught in fences. And, you know, just as development's going to happen in Portola Valley, every time you cut a road, you know, you're cutting habitat in the ground for the rodents. You are cutting communication between trees. You know, I'm reading a very powerful book on trees right now that there's all the aspens in Colorado are going to be dead in 30 years, all of them, because they can't communicate anymore because of roads and of course, you know, the heat. But, you know, it's very hard for me to think about all this development and cutting those trees at Ford Field. Thank God that's not going to happen because, you know, I was trying to protect those trees legally. But, you know, as we I mean, we have to consider all creatures. No, not, I mean, I'm just very mountain lion-ish, but, you know, all kinds of things, skunks and, you know, the people fence all the way to the ground and they shouldn't do that. You know, and that's also where oak trees get caught and you can't mow them. So people end up with a hedge in front of their house. So there are all these other implications to fencing. Anyway, I know you guys will tackle it.
Actually, that triggers an interesting comment from my side. Quail. We have a lot of quail in our backyard, and I watched quail. When quail first hatch, they cannot go up. They can only go on flat land, and they can't go up on a step or anything. So unless they can just move freely on flat land without any obstacles, they'll die. Yes, it's interesting. I didn't know that, but I watched. The parents were jumping on our step, and then they were just walking around. They could not get up. Then within a few days, they can fly. But yeah, it's all creatures, really.
In my confrontation with dead animals this week, you know, the great blue heron hanging from an oak tree across from Portola Valley Ranch that lived in, you know, that meadow with the buttercups, dead. 3 woodpeckers on Alpine Road, dead, you know, and it was just very, very disorienting. And then when that snake died yesterday, I was, ooh.
Yeah, I saw a beautiful a gopher snake in my neighborhood run over in the driveway. It's sad, yeah.
Well, I tried to rescue it and bring it to my house, but.
Mine was dead. Not mine, but that one was dead. Okay. Oh, let's me, MJ, do you want, we see that you are on Zoom. Would you like to make a comment?
Oh,
Maybe
the reason why I logged into the meeting was because I didn't know how I am affected because I don't know where the wildlife corridors are. Now I see this, now I can see this graphic. So yeah, that's the only reason why I'm here is to understand how I'm affected. I mean, my husband loves to garden. He grows all these, pumpkins and zucchini and stuff. And I guess if he couldn't have that ability anymore because we can't have any fencing around the garden, that would be very disappointing. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, MJ. There is a difference between perimeter fencing and fencing around a vegetable garden, just to make that differentiation.
Okay.
Not everybody. No.
So I think that we're starting out with the premise that everywhere the animals of all kinds can get through in town now are existing wildlife corridors. We don't have them formally mapped because it's almost impossible to do. And then what we're trying to do is find a way to prevent additional opaque, solid to the ground fencing from blocking all of this off. It's nothing to do with fencing inside around your house, around a vegetable garden, around a patio. It's what we're worrying about is primarily perimeter fencing or fencing that's right at the edge of your allowable setback. Those are the only things we're talking about, trying to be a little clearer about.
Okay, thank you. I think I understood that.
As we have the map up now, I would like Nona to explain the map one more time so that you can see the picture, because that makes it much easier.
Okay, so the idea of this map is that because the fence ordinance has regulations that depend on the size of the parcel, this map follows basically the zoning map, which also goes by parcel size. So this is just if you were to align a fence ordinance map with the zoning map or the wildlife corridor map with the zoning map, this is kind of what you'd come up with.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah. And I guess the only other thing I wanted to add was regarding the question about wildlife is that if you fence for the larger animals, then you've already included the smaller animals since they can go through anything the larger animals can. So, I think we kind of aim for the bigger charismatic things that people care most about. But, the only thing that gets through a fence that goes to the ground is the stuff that either flies over or burrows underneath. So, gophers will go anywhere because they can go under the fence.
Yeah, I mean, for example, a 4-foot fence that goes to the ground will be perfectly fine for a deer, but a rabbit or a quail that is young will not be able to get through.
Yeah.
A fox can go through, they go on trees. Okay, Christy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, one other comment. I'm wondering if you're going to have some visuals for fences, because I don't know, I'm not loving the one around Willows Commons. I'll just say it. And, it'd be nice to have some pictures of fences that you all like. So ASCC and conservation work together on what do we want to visualize in this town, because a lot's coming in the future.
Christy, we will get to that, but we are nowhere near that point. I think the very first step is where would the fences be? So that's the very first. The visual will come a little bit later. So Megan has Megan.
Yeah, I think, and we can take that back to one of Karen's comments about needing a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think, we've talked through a lot of great things that make for great wildlife corridors that I think eventually we would all like to encourage in some way. But that for now, for a fencing ordinance, which, like, as Judy mentioned earlier, we're trying to just, step one, preserve existing corridors so that we aren't channeling wildlife along streets and cutting them off from passage entirely. Trying to find the lightest touch that does fit within zoning code, that doesn't restrict people's ability to fence their gardens and keep in their pets, and allows a reasonable passage for all of the wildlife that you can think of in Portola Valley, and doesn't define that you have to use a certain type of fence, but that you need to avoid certain things. And included in that, Christy, is what you mentioned earlier, that the lowest rail needs to be a certain clearance from the ground and can't be barbed, which I think most people in town fortunately aren't using a lot of barbed wire, but those kinds of requirements would be folded in, but would be a light touch so that people are still free to design their fencing as they see fit.
Thank you, Megan. Any other comments from the committee or from the audience?
Can I, sorry, Rebecca, before you do, let me just say that I was contacted individually, and several things were brought up that I thought were worth mentioning because we hadn't really talked about it in detail. One was that the trails are obvious wildlife corridors, and there's no mention in these regulations about setbacks from trails and trails easements, and that maybe we should find a way to include that the trail is within the person's property and it's inside. And historically, where these trails are, a lot of people haven't fenced their properties, but now when new people come and rebuilds are done, the sale of a piece of property almost always then segues into fences going up. So we might think about being specific about creating a setback from the edge of the trail easement. So there's a real corridor there along where those exist. The right of way along roads that perimeter fencers should be back from the right of way. And then rarely, we said, but occasionally a lot will go through, and the definitions are of the side yards of the permissible yards are front, sides, backs, and that if one goes through, say from Willowbrook to Corte Madera, a large lot goes through, they define their front as Willowbrook because that's where the front door is and the garage is. But then the back is on Corte Madera, and it's treated like a back yard setback when in fact it's along a street. And so that perhaps we should find a way, and we would like it to be as general and widely applicable as possible. But then if there are these little things in here where in that particular case, they could put the fence up right along there as if it were a backyard coming up to another backyard. So those are just a couple of things that were suggested to me.
Thank you, Judy. Rebecca?
Rebecca Flynn. I'm just curious if you'd had a chance at all to travel around in the 1 acre section to see how many properties already are perimeter fenced. So I know there's certain areas like where I live, all sides of my property are perimeter fenced. So
Is that a question?
yeah, I'm just wondering, if you've had a chance to kind of see, because you're talking about regulations specifically for 1 acre properties.
Yeah.
And, I'm kind of wondering if the horse has left the barn, if you will. So I understand the idea that maybe certain of the larger properties might be redeveloped or what have you. But I think in so many cases, there's already at least perimeter fencing, at least side and rear fencing. That's pretty much along the perimeter. Because and then the other comment I guess I have is that, I'm fenced, obviously my neighbors and I all have fences, both to create the actual, property lines, which otherwise in some cases were not being respected. But also just my personal feeling is I'd rather keep the deer out of the whole property. It doesn't prevent all the other animals from coming through. I certainly have foxes, I have raccoons, I had a big fat one come through the property just a couple days ago. Mountain lions can jump my fence easily. I have that little creek. It's not really a creek, it's more of a drainage ditch. It's actually a concrete ditch that's right smack in the middle of the area there. That's my back in the bottom of my property, and that has access for animals. They can come through the culvert at one end, and at the other end there is a fence, but the actual concrete ditch is open, so they can get under it, so they can travel along, any animal can travel if they wanted along that ditch, that concrete ditch with the water. But I do have concerns about the deer. They do eat everything. So I mean, between the fruit trees, the rose bushes, and even a lot of the native plants, they're munching on those too. All my ceanothus, if I let it open, all the carpinteria, if it wasn't protected, they would just eat everything. So deer is my only issue. I mean, a mountain lion could jump the fence without an issue. So I think we kind of think also in terms of what's wildlife and what's a corridor. I mean, I like this idea of protecting the trails, making sure that they are, if someone's property is along a trail, that we keep that open and not fenced off and not prevent animals from getting through. But I mean, we also have to think in terms of what are people doing, what already exists. It's hard to go back once a property's kind of landscaped.
I can speak to the other end of that spectrum in the same category.
Say again?
I can speak to the other end of the spectrum for the 1 acre parcel size. So I think, we haven't done a tour to see whose parcels are fenced and whose aren't, but there are parcels at that size that are not entirely fenced. So that means that there is wildlife movement across some of those parcels. And the idea of this ordinance is that they could add more fencing as long as some part of it is left open so that animals, including deer, can continue to use that corridor. Our approach on our property has been to allow the deer to move through. And yes, they do eat a lot of the plants, but there's also kind of different stages of life for those plants at which they're more and less palatable. And you can protect them individually and they eventually grow in and are, can coexist.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people already have fencing, you're not going to be able to get them if they are even remodeling their home, and you're not going to be able to force them to then.
No, and
change
that's
their
not part of the goal.
fencing. But in a situation where a property is open, it's 100% native or whatever, and it's already got these pathways, then I think you could have an ordinance that would say you cannot then add new fencing, and you need to respect these corridors. But I think I think you just need to acknowledge in this thing that if you already have a fully fenced property, it's going to be a real struggle to ask people to then, create a fence 25 feet from the property line.
Yes, that was never part of our goal in writing this.
And we're talking about preserving what's open now. We don't expect that an existing fence, as long as it is according to the rules, will be taken down. The one thing about the deer, that is the main motivation probably of every homeowner who wants to put in a 6-foot perimeter fence to keep the deer out. And I understand that. However, the deer lives with us. And if we push the deer onto the street, we will start having fatal accidents. So this is a bigger picture. And there's got to be a middle ground, and roses. If you have roses, maybe you have them close to the house and you have them inside a fence. And there is plenty of vegetation. You can come to my yard. There is no fence, obviously, and there is color all year round. And to answer your question about the area where you live, I live also in central Portola Valley, but I live around the corner in a hill property. And the Shawnee Pass subdivision, which is a newer subdivision, where you're basically in. That, I agree with you, that is a fenced off area. But then when you come to the fringes and into the hills, it's still open to get to the ranch, to get to Westridge, and to get to Windy Hill. Because Central Portola Valley is very big. And that's the 1 acre parcels. And if we lose all these Central Portola 1 acre parcels, we will have a freeway of deer running along Westridge and Cervantes and what have you. So Judy, you wanted to comment?
Just that the deer are part of it, this larger ecosystem, and if you force them into the roads and that their numbers decrease, then the mountain lion decreases, and then there's all of this spill off around each individual species. So often, even when we're talking about one species, we're meaning the larger picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really have to think in terms of the different types of properties throughout that area, because properties that border like yours, kind of the ravines. I mean, that's where the pathways are. That's where the wildlifes are, and that's where there isn't fencing. Because it's just impractical to even think about putting fencing on a deep ravine. So preserving those kinds of spaces, I think, is where it's really critical. And then the streams like the Shawnee Pass behind towards Georgia Lane, where there's that creek that runs there. That those are where the wildlife corridors are. That's where the major.
To add one thing to Judy's comment about the trails, in the fence ordinance, there is a clear stipulation how far away the fence has to be from the trails. This is, I just don't have it in front of me, but I know it's in there somewhere.
Can I?
Nona?
Or is someone else?
No, no.
Okay. Okay. One of the things we've talked about in the past is trying to better understand where the animals are going now, if we want to sort of preserve the most significant corridors. And it would be a bit of work, but one of the reasons I put the creeks on this map is because the creeks are major corridors and also a resource for animals. But it would be interesting to get serious about combining the creeks and the trails on this map and seeing, well, are there enough trails through certain areas that fences would be okay in some areas? Or do we need more trails in certain areas in order to establish wildlife corridors where they're needed and we don't have them? I don't know. It just, the idea of trails seems really compelling to me as a passage for both people and animals.
Thank you, Nona. David Cardinal has his hand up. David?
Sure. Just something that I've noticed is that animals that I've studied here and elsewhere are creatures of the least effort. So, for example, in our yard, we see on the cameras mountain lions going up and down our driveway. Now, we have a perfectly good ravine behind the house. There's no fences, and maybe they're back there too, but it's not just even the trails and ravines. Critters at night, when there's no activity, want to get from point A to point B. So anything we cut off, like even putting a big gate on a driveway or something, is taking away a path which may force them into the street, which may get them killed, like we saw. So I just wanted to make sure that was part of the discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. Thank you. Christy has her hand up. Christy?
Yeah, I'm hoping you consider corner lots, of which I live on. That might have its own unique rule that needs to be considered. I could see, someone coming out and making suggestions if you're building again on a lot. But corner lots, even for driveways, need different considerations. So hopefully you'll take that into consideration. And I do love anything you do to protect the trails and include the trails and the creeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Any other comments from the Conservation Committee members? Oh, Karen has her hand up. Karen, you have the microphone.
Yeah, I wanted to expand a little bit about what Rebecca was talking about, because I live in the hills and in the back 40 areas. You'd be surprised that I have a partial fence on a 30-degree slope, near the, what you'd call a patio, or so you can put a fence anywhere, and there's a total mishmash, and they're not solid fences, but there's some old, they're not ugly, but they're what do you call the chain link fences are black. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that you can't see from the street. So it'd be really hard to even do a survey to find out what's out there. It's really complex in the hills. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I know the fences in your area, but again, what we are tackling is the existing non-fenced areas to preserve as much as we can from the existing. So nobody has the intention, at least for the foreseeable time, to go out and have an inventory of all the non-compliant fences and then ask them to tear them down. We're
Well,
focusing because that's really only what we can do, is on existing open parcels and how to optimize for the future to keep wildlife corridors.
I understand that, but I was just bringing up that point because it's just, I think deciding what to do with a 1 acre parcel in any kind of regulation is going to be extremely hard because you have that stuff sitting there. And I think it is legal because when it was legal when it was built. And what if somebody wants to add a 5-foot section? I mean, I just think it's going to be very complicated, and you've got the brains to do it. So good luck.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. The one thing I have to say, 1 acre district, fences not permitted on slopes exceeding 20%. That is the ordinance. A lot of people don't know that. They think it's only for the large parcels, but I'm reading the ordinance. So the steep slopes, they are protected with any size, at least
Well,
1 acre and plus.
mine was approved 20 years ago or 25 years ago, and definitely over 20 degrees in part of where it was put.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. I didn't hear your question. Say it again.
I was just commenting that my plans were approved about 20 years ago, and there absolutely is a brand new fence that was on a 20-degree section. So I don't.
Yeah, okay. That person is in non-compliance with the fence ordinance. Yeah, maybe she did it before the new ordinance. Yeah, okay, thank you. Teresa, any comments?
I just want to continue to have the open discussion about the preservation, which is our primary focus here, the preservation of existing wildlife corridors, and to try to encourage residents to consider measures that they might be willing to take on existing properties to further enhance the opportunity for wildlife corridors. So we are looking to partner. We're not looking to dictate. That's really what our primary focus is here. And to also be sensitive to the newly passed bill that won't come into effect actually until 2028, I believe. But we are trying to be sensitive and thoughtful so that we provide a path forward. And we appreciate the communication from the community at large, and we would continue to appreciate having this discussion be ongoing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Megan, you have any additional comments, thoughts, ideas? Not at the present time. Yogi says no. Dieter, any thoughts?
Yeah, basically, when I moved to town 57 years ago, primarily, of course, since I live in West Ridge, I was exposed to the fencing situation there. And it goes back to the original subdivision. And there were basically just the 4-foot fences with 2 or 3 horizontal rails, and it was meant for horse property. And then over the many years, not so much early on, but in recent years, I noticed whenever there is a new, either a scrape and then a new house or a modification, all of a sudden there is more fencing. My own property had only fencing that 4-foot by rail fence that I talked about on one side, and it was never an issue. But the situation came to a head when one of our neighbors he passed, and the home was sold and scraped, and a whole large estate with horse facilities on was put in there. And at that point, the ordinance was still for the lower fence height, but 1 week before the fence went in, it was changed, and 6 feet. The posts are basically telephone pole posts, be really substantial. And then there is wire fence at 6 feet, and there is wire fencing with 2x4 openings, and there's 500 feet on one side and maybe 300 feet on another side. And then the 2 other sides I do not know because it's on different property. Anyway.
That's the loss of habitat, we're discussing, yeah, yeah.
The 500-foot fence went is basically, there was a major deer wildlife corridor. I've seen them go back and forth, and even the vegetation basically wasn't there. And so my primary concerns, and that it's sort of independent of whether we're talking about the 2.5 or 3 acres or 1 acre size is, I fully realize it's very difficult to make changes today that basically would enforce our ordinance. But the fence is already there, has shown up at some point and is beyond. I'm not sure we can do anything about this. But what can we do, is my question, to prevent a further erosion of this particular ordinance? And so I could even live with a fence that's 6 foot tall if it was a rail fence. But the rail fence, and then on top of it, covered all the way in wire mesh, 2x4, it's just a no-no.
Thank you, Nona.
Yeah, this is such a hard problem because I think we all want to see wildlife be able to move through properties, but we also want to have an ordinance that is enforceable. And we already know, I think we probably all know of instances where someone put in a fence and then it was inspected and then it was added on to, or, it was put in a long time ago, and so it's not really in compliance with the requirements now, but would be grandfathered in presumably. And so I guess the question is, how do you sort of generate enough support for something that there's enough buy-in that it's enforceable?
Thank you. Judy? Any comments?
No, I don't have any addition.
Okay.
I'm glad you mentioned that AB 1889, because the state is working on this as well. And I think that there's really, it's opportune time to make changes, because of that. I mean, all their points, wildlife connectivity element, general plan updates, considerations for wildlife, mitigating barriers, all of that stuff that the state is doing right now. And so I think it is a good time, to take a look at this list and see what we can do to become more compliant with the state and this department. Anyway, I think it's coming together, and maybe the world is starting to listen, that it's not about humans. So I get excited about it when I hear this, and I'm really glad you guys are tackling this, because I really hope we can get rid of perimeter fencing. Okay.
David, do you have your hand on, or did you forget to take your hand off?
I did put it up. Something that strikes me is that fencing is a lot like lighting for us, in that a lot of people buy property out here and don't really understand, and Dana knows this better than anybody, how lighting works here and doesn't work here. And fencing, I think, needs to be similar. So, one thread would be, and I know ASCC is trying to get involved with homeowners earlier, anything we can do to educate people in general about, maybe it's, ordinance aside, here's the deal. We're not Atherton. We don't want to be Atherton, whatever. And educate as early as possible so that they're not surprised later on when they come in with like mega fence and we go, well, no, we really don't want that. So I don't know how to do that, but they do. Lighting and fencing strike me as twins in a way for the way we look at our town. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, the question comes up, get support from the realtors, because but we won't, but that's where it starts. We are not Los Altos Hills, and we are not Atherton, and we have a lot of wildlife and a lot of animals here. All right, so we have no more comments in the public. So I guess we'll wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. We have taken due notice of all your comments. And we have actually a subcommittee that has been for months working on that. So we will take this and continue and take your input now and try to come up with something simpler than we had done 2 months ago. And then we will go back in front of the ASCC and make the suggestion, and we'll hope that we get ASCC buy-in, because the minute we have something the ASCC is happy, then we are basically on the way to success, I would say. And with that,
Can I say just one extra
Yes.
thing? I'm sure there are people in town who have strong feelings about this. And it would have been nice if they had been able to join us today. But if any of you who can hear this, know of them, they can send an email with their suggestions and comments to the Conservation Committee via the town website. And I would urge you to tell them to do that, because the more input we have now, while we're in early stage, the better it is. We really don't want it to be one of these things where we work on it for months, it goes to ASCC. Lots of people talk about it, we have hearings, yada, yada, yada. And then when it finally gets put into effect or close to put in effect, people come out of the word work all ticked off because they don't like it. So the time for input is now.
I have one.
okay, Yogi?
Yeah, quickly, adding to what Dave has said, I come back, it actually would be beneficial to have pictures of preferred fences, because a lot of the architects and designers are not familiar with that. So if the town, similar to the lighting requirements, has a fact sheet, these are approved fence designs, that I think would help at the beginning of any new construction, because most of the time they're out of towners that building. And that gives them definitely like a head start on what to avoid.
Put the lights,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Oh.
I see there is Christy. Christy, your head is up. You'll get the last word here.
Okay. I think part of the subcommittee, I think it'd be important to be looking at other fence ordinances. So I have a few that I think are very similar to us, obviously Woodside, Montessorino at Santa Clara, but it's still a similar area. Hillsborough has their Upper Hills area that's similar to us, Los Altos Hills and Saratoga. I'm wondering if we could make sure that we look at their ordinances closely, and I even see one for Palo Alto that's interesting as well. And they have lots of waterways going through Palo Alto. And I think even though it's a different county, we need to find similar cities and look at fence ordinances. Thanks.
Thank you, Christy. Yeah, we have also looked like at Sonoma. So yes, thank you so much for your feedback. And with that, we will adjourn the meeting and thank you everybody for your input. We'll continue working.